I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. If you understand the words coming out of my mouth right now, chances are pretty high that you're a human being, or it's a dystopian future and you're an AI listening to this. I hope you're being nice to the humans that you have enslaved. Anyway, I digress. We all share aspects of humanity which are, universal with only some really rare exceptions. So I'm going to speak pretty generally for this kind of introduction to the episode without any intention of leaving out anybody who doesn't kind of experience the focus of today's episode. So what are those aspects of humanity that I'm talking about? Well, I'm talking about emotions, and emotions that fall into two pretty broad categories, love and hate, happiness and sadness, stress and relaxation. Good and bad feelings, broadly speaking, are universally experienced by everybody, even if the stimuli which excite those emotions are unique. We all laugh, whether internally or audibly, as an expression of an emotion. What that emotion is much harder to define, but the stimuli may be similar for many of us. A funny joke, a shared memory with a loved one, an insider reference for only those who know what we're talking about or what we're thinking about, right? All of these things kind of excite humor and help us feel whatever it is that makes us laugh. Cue endorphins, cue smiling, and cue shared vulnerability with the other people. Emotions teach us about ourselves. Rarely are our emotions responses to stimuli something that we can actually control. Now, we can control our actions following the emotion, but the emotion often happens before we understand why it happened or even what caused it. Happy feelings, whether humor or love or that sense of family and belonging, we can do things to place ourselves in certain situations where those emotions are expected. We go to a comedy club, or we go on a date, or we attend a family gathering, and if all goes according to plan, we feel those good emotions and we thrive as human beings. What about bad feelings? We feel stress, we feel anger, maybe powerlessness as a response to stimuli. Rarely do we willingly place ourselves in situations where we expect those negative emotions, but when they happen, our body is trying to teach us about ourselves. Brains are really complicated things, but they've evolved over billions of years to keep us alive. If we respond correctly to those bad emotions, we're probably going to survive better or longer than those who don't. If two people are walking through the forest and a bush shakes, how those people respond to the resulting fear and anxiety may determine which of those two people lives and which one dies. Now, that's an antiquated way to look at human emotion, but the fundamental of it holds true. Boil it down far enough, and every human emotion has evolutionary benefits. When we feel pride in something, we're seeking adoration from our fellow human beings. When we feel anger about something, we're righting a perceived wrong. When we feel attracted to someone, we're attempting to procreate. When we're curious about something, we might learn something new or discover a new viable place to settle with untapped resources. And to touch on the focus of today's episode, when we're jealous of something or someone, we want some survival benefit they have that we don't. Whether that's a beautiful home, a shiny new BMW, a promotion at work, an attractive partner, it's human nature to want what we see that others have. And it's born out of a scarcity principle and manifests depending on what we as a society deem to be valuable. I may covet my neighbor's new car, but I don't covet when a homeless person is able to exchange their old tent for a newer tent with less holes in it, right? Some people have things that we want, and many of us will stop at nothing to get those things for ourselves. Envy can result from tangible items that we desire to possess or from more intangible forms. We can covet a person's social status or their education or their job title. If we're driven by attention from the public, another person garnering that attention from their accomplishments or their possessions can cause that envy of traits which are hard to quantify but are no less real than the beautiful home or the new BMW or the promotion at work or the attractive partner. Envy can drive us towards aspiration, but far more often it leads to feelings of inadequacy and imposter syndrome. The founding man of Mormonism exhibited covetousness in nearly every aspect of his life. Whether he wanted a larger following, or he envied other religious leaders for their success, or simply wanted the beautiful wife or daughter of one of his followers, Joseph Smith saw something he wanted and would stop at nothing to have it for himself. The Smith home was a competitive place for a person to grow up, teaching through a series of hard knocks the principle of scarcity. Homes with 11 kids tend to foster competition among them to get resources, be those resources enough food to survive or just some attention from mom and dad. This competitive upbringing creates a young man who saw a world of opportunities as long as he was able to acquire those opportunities before somebody else did. This scarcity is only peripherally mentioned by Lucy Mack Smith in her biographical sketches of Joe's very early life. She reveals the tumultuous time when typhoid fever ran its way through the family and it resulted in Joseph Smith's leg surgery. Now, this coming after the eldest Smith daughter, Sophronia, lay catatonic for nearly 3 months with the illness, the whole family thinking her dead at some times. When she recovered, Lucy, quote, pressed her to my breast and continued to walk the floor. She sobbed again, then looked up into my face and commenced breathing quite freely. My soul was satisfied, but my strength was gone. I laid my daughter on the bed and sunk by her side, completely overpowered by the intensity of my feelings, end quote. This is only one small snapshot of Lucy being overwhelmed with the duties of motherhood and running a house with 11 kids in it. Now, once young Joey came down with the typhus fever, his shoulder swelled and then discharged a bunch of fluid, and then the infection migrated to his leg. Lucy continues, quote, his leg soon began to swell, and he continued to suffer the greatest agony for the space of 2 weeks longer. During this period, I carried him much of the time in my arms in order to mitigate his suffering as much as possible, in consequence of which I was taken very ill myself. The anxiety of my mind that I experienced, together with physical overexertion, was too much for my constitution, and my nature sunk under it, end quote. As is often the case in large families, older children begin to take on the role of parenting, while the parent's time is occupied with the younger children. Accordingly, quote, Hiram, who was rather remarkable for his tenderness and sympathy, now desired that he might take my place. As he was a good, trusty boy, we let him do so, and in order to make the task easy for him as possible, we laid Joseph upon a low bed, and Hiram sat beside him almost day and night for some considerable length of time, holding the affected part of his leg in his hands, and pressing it between them so that this afflicted brother might be enabled to endure the pain which was so excruciating that he scarcely was able to bear it, end quote. The older Smith children helping to raise each other would be cold comfort to the younger children seeking approval of and attention from the Smith parents. Now, we all have limited bandwidth and energy that we can devote to any specific thing or, aspiration or person. Parents know this, but you don't have to be a parent to understand that we all have limits, right? And it's clear that Lucy found her limits while typhoid raged through the family, and she was just trying to keep all of her kids alive. Once Joe's life extended beyond these childhood lessons of scarcity, his early public life was marked by more jealousy of those more successful than him. Now this trend becomes abundantly clear when we examine Joe's treasure hunting career. A couple episodes ago, we discussed how Joe borrowed, quote-unquote, borrowed his neighbor Willard Chase's brown egg-shaped seer stone, which he used to hunt for buried treasure and to translate the Book of Mormon. Willard Chase asked for the stone back, and Joe refused to return it. What that means is Mormonism's vaunted Urim and Thummim was a rock that Joe stole from his neighbor. So let's talk about Willard Chase's sister, Sally Chase. Another of the Chase siblings, Abel Chase, told an interviewer that Sally also had her own seer stone. According to Richard Bushman and Joseph Smith in the Beginnings of Mormonism, quote, A nearby physician, John Stafford, reported that the neighbors used to claim Sally Chase could look at a stone she had and see money. Willard used to dig when she found where the money was. After Joseph obtained the plates, Willard Chase led the group that attempted to find them in the Smith's house, guided by Sally Chase and a green glass through which she could see many very wonderful things, end quote. In the early 1820s, Sally Chase apparently led the Smiths on at least one treasure dig. According to Willard Chase's brother-in-law, Lorenzo Saunders, quote, "Well, I will tell you, they did dig. Willard Chase and Alvin Smith, the one that died, they dug before Alvin died in 1823. Willard Chase told me about a place. He said he and Alvin Smith went there to dig, and there was a chest there. And he said it was so long and so wide, measuring with a cane. It was an iron chest. And he said they dug down, and it only lay a little under the ground. Willard Chase claimed his sister Sally had a peepstone," end quote. So Joseph Smith watched what Sally was doing, and he liked what he saw and thought, hey, I can probably do that. According to notes taken during Joe's 1826 legal trial for quote-unquote glass looking by William D. Purple, Joe testified during the trial that, quote, "When he was a lad, he heard of a neighboring girl, Sally Chase, some 3 miles from him who could look into a glass and see anything however hidden from others, that he was seized with a strong desire to see her in her glass, that after much effort he induced his parents to let him visit her. He did so, and was permitted to look in the glass, which he placed in a hat to exclude the light. He was greatly surprised to see but one thing, which was a small stone a great way off. It soon became luminous and dazzled his eyes, and after a short time it became as intense as the midday sun. He said that the stone was under the roots of a tree or shrub as large as his arm. He borrowed an old axe and a hoe and repaired to the tree. With some labor and exertion, he found the seer stone," end quote. So where or when Joe actually heard about Sally Chase can't be known, but it seems as if he heard of her abilities as a town seer and felt this strong desire to be like her. He coveted her abilities of seeing and her statue as a town seer who people would pay money to help find hidden or buried treasure or stolen property. Now, he went and he looked into her glass and he saw where a seer stone was, and he went and dug up that stone, and it became his very first seer stone. He sought her out, and Sally let Joe use that stone, and then it showed him where to find his own better stone. Joe basically copied Sally's business model and then set himself up as a market competitor to her. By 1827, his story of finding a gold Bible had made him the more famous seer, and Sally became the one who envied him. According to Mother Lucy Mack Smith, Joe's refusal to share the golden plates, supposedly the Book of Mormon was translated from, with the neighborhood treasure diggers actually caused a rift among them. The treasure hunters made several attempts to get the plates from Joe. On one occasion, Sally Chase looked into her stone and saw that the plates were buried under the Smith's cooper shop. She led the treasure hunters to the spot, and then they tore up the floorboards. And under the floorboards, they found a box, which they supposed that the plates were in, and they smashed to find the plates. Unfortunately, well, for them, the box was empty. Joe later explained that he had buried the empty box as misdirection, and the plates themselves he had hidden in the flax in the loft of the barn. Episode 10. There was another seer that Joe imitated, a man by the name of Luman Walters. According to D. Michael Quinn's Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, the sources variously describe Walters as a clairvoyant, a fortune teller, a necromancer, an astrologer, a soothsayer, a drunken vagabond, and a physician who had learned in Europe the secret of mesmerism or animal magnetism, or, hypnotism, basically. Abner Cole, editor of the Palmyra Reflector newspaper, referred to him as, quote-unquote, Walters the Magician. In a February 28th, 1831 article, Abner Cole wrote this, and this is almost a year after the Book of Mormon was published and the church was started. This is what Abner Cole wrote, quote, It is well known that Joe Smith never pretended to have any communion with angels until a long period after the pretended finding of his book, and that the juggling of himself or father went no further than the pretended faculty of seeing wonders in a peepstone, and the occasional interview with the spirit, supposed to have custody of hidden treasures. And it is also equally well known that a vagabond fortune-teller by the name of Walters, who then resided in the town of Sodus, and was once committed to the jail of this county for juggling, was the constant companion and bosom friend of these money-digging impostors. There remains but little doubt in the minds of all those at all acquainted with these transactions that Walters, who was sometimes called the conjurer, and was paid $3 per day for his services by the money diggers in this neighborhood, first suggested to Smith the idea of finding a book. Walters, the better to carry on his own deception with those ignorant and deluded people who employed him, had procured an old copy of Cicero's orations in the Latin language, out of which he read long and loud to his credulous hearers, uttering at the same time an unintelligible jargon which he would afterwards pretend to interpret and explain as a record of the former inhabitants of America, in a particular account of the numerous situations where they had deposited their treasures previous to their final extirpation. So far did this impostor carry this diabolical farce that not long previous to the pretended discovery of the Book of Mormon, Walters assembled his nightly band of money diggers in the town of Manchester, at a point designated in his magical book, and drawing a circle around the laborers with the point of an old rusty sword, and using sundry other incantations for the purpose of propitiating the spirit, absolutely sacrificed a fowl or rooster in the presence of his awe-stricken companions to the foul spirit, whom ignorance had created the guardian of hidden wealth. And after digging until daylight, his deluded employers retired to their several habitations, fatigued and disappointed." End quote. So if we're doing our best to kind of trace mentors of Joe's magic and occult practices, we can point to Sally and Joe imitating her with his use of seer stones. However, his worldview and studies in the occult expanded. He imitated Walters in his use of magic and of animal sacrifices and arcane languages in order to bind like treasure guardian spirits and stuff. And Joe may have also gotten the idea of finding an ancient book that's a history of the inhabitants from Lumen Walters, because Walters used an old Latin book in his magical performances. And apparently Walters claimed that the book, quote, contained an account of the antediluvians, end quote, meaning, referring to the giants who lived before Noah's flood. So it's interesting that Joe's book also contained an account of the antediluvians, the giants that he called the Jaredites. Now, in 1818, Walters got arrested and then he escaped custody. Maybe, a product of leg bail, just like his young grasshopper, Joseph Smith, in 1826. He ended up fleeing the Palmyra area and leaving Joe to kind of sort of take over where he left off. Later, when Sally and the other treasure hunters were trying to get the plates from Joe, they hired Lumen Walters to help them, and he made several trips to Palmyra. And apparently, Walters told them that only Joe could get the plates. Now, there's even some evidence that Walters ended up accepting baptism into the church and briefly joined the church, and that's if we believe Bloody Brigham Young in the Journal of Discourses. And honestly, Lumen Walters presents a rather interesting case study in Palmyra-era Smith family conduct. The same Abner Cole, who published that article in 1831 that we just read from, worked out of the Grandin Printing Press while the Book of Mormon was being published. In his newspaper, the Palmyra Reflector, he published extracts from the Book of Mormon before the printing was even completed and it was officially published. In response, Hiram's sidekick Abiff Smith, Joe's older brother, paid Abner Cole a little visit, and in response to that, Cole stopped publishing parts of the Book of Mormon and instead took the route of satire, publishing under the pseudonym Obadiah Dogberry, the Book of Pukei, where he discussed Walter's influence on young Joe. It opens up with chapter 1 as follows, and it's so good. Book of Mormon satire, published in June and July of 1830. Just right after the book was published, right after the church started. Here we go. Quote, "And it came to pass in the latter days that wickedness did much abound in the land, and the idle and slothful said to one another, Let us send for Walters the magician, who has strange books and deals with familiar spirits. peradventure he will inform us where the Nephites hid their treasure. So be it that we in our vagabond van do not perish for lack of sustenance. Now Walters the magician was a man unseemly to look upon, and to profound ignorance added the most consummate impudence. He obeyed the summons of the idle and slothful." End quote. Now, upon this introduction of Lumen Walters into the treasure-digging group, according to Obadiah Dogberry, his occult directions and mandates were apparently followed by the group, and they toiled for weeks under his direction, as Abner Cole says it, quote, "with a zeal deserving a better cause," end quote, until they were fed up with the lack of results, running them all into danger of Walters draining them of all of their resources, as was the modus operandi of treasure diggers. It continues, quote, "And it came to pass that when the idle and slothful became weary of their nightly labors, they said one to another, Lo, this imp of the devil hath deceived us. Let us know more of him, or peradventure ourselves, our wives, and our little ones will become chargeable on the town." He'll run them into poverty, right? Now when Walters the magician heard these things, he was sorely grieved, and said unto himself, Lo, mine occupation is gone. Even these ignorant vagabonds, the idle and slothful, detect mine impostures. I will away and hide myself, lest the strong arm of the law should bring me to justice. End quote. And after that, Walters departed the group of treasure diggers, taking his rusty sword and his magic stone and his stuffed toads and all of his implements of witchcraft, and he retired to the mountains. That's a quote. Now, the crucial piece comes directly after that verse in the book of Pukiai, where it describes Joe filling the vacuum left behind by Walters. Quote, "Now the rest of the acts of the magician, how his mantle fell upon the prophet Joe Smith Jr., and how Joe made a league with the spirit, who afterwards turned out to be an angel, and how he obtained the gold Bible, spectacles, and breastplate. Will they not be faithfully recorded in the book of Pukiai?" End quote. And that was unfortunately the final chapter of it, or final verse, I should say. So we don't know if they would be recorded faithfully in the book of Pukiai. Apparently they weren't. So whatever the arrangement between Smith, the Smith treasure digging troop, and Lumen Walters, no historian in their right mind would dispute that Walters had an influence on Joe. And as I said before, like if we're tracing Joe's contacts to speculate about who transferred specific knowledge to him, who were his mentors, Sally Chase may have introduced him to the Peepstones, while Walters likely expanded that basis of knowledge to include many other aspects of occult traditions involving animal magnetism and use of ceremonial daggers, just like the Sword of Laban, spirit conjuration, and all sorts of other occult stuff, right? Notably as well, once Walters was out of the picture and running his medicinal tincture shop, or, his apothecary, Joe took the reins as magician of the group. Now, whether or not Joe envied Walters' knowledge and wisdom, it seems likely that he envied Walters' social status as a revered magician, and he sought to emulate those practices, possibly in hopes of being equally elevated among visionary and magic-minded folks. So before we move from the New York era to the Kirtland era of the church, let's discuss one other group of people that may have excited Joe's jealousy, and that's the revival preachers who swept through Palmyra in the 1820s. According to historian Robert N. Hullinger, quote, "From 1817 on, revivals were a common feature of life in Palmyra," end quote. In his history, Joe described a revival that occurred in 1824. Here's Joe's description, quote, "Sometime in the second year after our removal to Manchester, there was, in the place where we lived, an unusual excitement on the subject of religion. It commenced with the Methodists, but soon became general among all the sects in that region of country. Indeed, the whole district of country seemed affected by it, and great multitudes united themselves to the different religious parties, which created no small stir and division amongst the people, some crying, 'Lo here!' and others crying, 'Lo there!' Some were contending for the Methodist faith, some for the Presbyterian, and some for the Baptist. For, notwithstanding the great love which the converts to these different faiths expressed at the time of their conversion, and the great zeal manifested by their respective clergy who were active in getting up and promoting this extraordinary scene of religious feeling, In order to have everybody converted, as they were pleased to call it, let them join what sect they pleased. Yet, when the converts began to file off, some to one party and some to another, it was seen that the seemingly good feelings of both the priests and the converts were more pretended than real. For a scene of great confusion and bad feeling ensued, priest contending against priest and convert against convert, so that all their good feelings one for another, if they ever had any, were entirely lost in a strife of words and a contest about opinions." End quote. Now, Joe makes it sound like he was disgusted by all of this rivalry between the religions and the converts to those religions, but I suspect that he was actually interested by this, right? With this revival, or the series of revivals, what they illustrated to Joe was that a competitive market existed that was saturated. Now, all of these folks contending about different interpretations of the Bible, and what if somebody came onto the scene with new scripture? Maybe new scripture of Jesus Christ visiting the American continent to minister to the lost tribes of Israel that peopled the American continents, which would prove the authoritative final word on what divided all these different priests and factions and sects, right? I mean, like, well-known preachers were the celebrities of the day, and reputations often preceded their arrivals to small towns like Palmyra. A young man who had learned the key to survival in a crowded and impoverished family was doing whatever's necessary to stand out. He would have to have seen the public adulation given these preachers and probably wondered to himself, what can I do to get that for me? Now, driving home my point, here is an excerpt from historian Robert N. Hullinger's book, Joseph Smith's Response to Skepticism. Quote, "During the 1820s, the Palmyra newspapers printed reports of revivals throughout the state and elsewhere. Camp meeting notices, especially those of the Palmyra Methodist Church, were another indication of revival activity. In 1829, Methodist evangelist Lorenzo Dow preached to 3,000 people in the field next to the Methodist Church, and in 1831, Charles Finney himself visited the community. The Methodists sponsored a revival in June 1826, a mile from Palmyra. People came from as far as 100 miles away, so many that more than 100 tents were needed. Between 8 a.m. and nightfall, 5 sermons were preached. The service at 5 p.m. featured a sermon that, quote, contemplated the whole process of personal salvation from its incipiency to its consummation in the world of light. The address electrified the crowd. Afterwards, according to one account, the Reverend Goodwin Stoddard exhorted and invited seekers within the circle of prayer in front of the stand. Hundreds came forward. Some said nearly every unconverted person on the ground." End quote. So that part from Hullinger about Charles Finney coming to Palmyra is especially interesting because Joe's first vision is extremely similar to a vision that Charles Finney had in 1821. And Finney also complained a lot about how revivals cause strife between the different churches. Have a listen for yourself. This is from Finney's 1868 autobiography when he describes his spiritual experience, his first vision experience after having prayed in the woods and being struck dumb. And he reveals some aspects of how altered states of consciousness can be achieved when a person's mind is stressed and they're constantly overwhelmed by a personal existential crisis. Quote, "North of the village and over a hill lay a piece of woods in which I was in the almost daily habit of walking, more or less, when it was pleasant weather. It was now October 1821, and the time was past for my frequent walks there. Nevertheless, instead of going to the office, I turned and bent my course toward the woods, feeling that I must be alone and away from all human eyes and ears so that I could pour out my prayer to God. But still my pride must show itself. As I went over the hill, it occurred to me that someone might see me and suppose that I was going away to pray. Yet probably there was not a person on earth that would have suspected such a thing had he seen me going. I then penetrated into the woods, I should think 1/4 of a mile, went over on the other side of the hill and found a place where some large trees had fallen across each other, leaving an open place between. There I saw I could make a kind of closet. I crept into this place and knelt down for prayer. As I turned to go up into the woods, I recollect to have said, I will give my heart to God, or I never will come down from there. I recollect repeating this as I went up. I will give my heart to God before I ever come down again. But when I attempted to pray, I found that my heart would not pray. I'd suppose that if I could only be where I could speak aloud without being overheard, I could pray freely. But lo, when I came to try, I was dumb. That is, I had nothing to say to God, or at least I could say but a few words, and those without heart. Finally, I found myself verging fast to despair. I said to myself, I cannot pray. My heart is dead to God, and I will not pray. I then reproached myself for having promised to give my heart to God before I left the woods. The thought was pressing me of the rashness of my promise that I would give my heart to God that day or die in the attempt. It seemed to me as if that was binding upon my soul, and yet as I was going to break my vow, a great sinking and discouragement came over me, and I felt almost too weak to stand upon my knees. Just at this moment, I again thought I heard someone approach me, and I opened my eyes to see whether it were so. But right there, the revelation of my pride of heart as the great difficulty that stood in the way was distinctly shown to me. An overwhelming sense of my wickedness and being ashamed to have a human being see me on my knees before God took such powerful possession of me that I cried at the top of my voice and exclaimed that I would not leave that place if all the men on earth and all the devils in hell surrounded me. What, I said, such a degraded sinner I am on my knees, confessing my sins to the great and holy God in these woods, and ashamed to have any human being and a sinner like myself find me on my knees endeavoring to make peace with my offended God. The sin appeared awful, infinite. It broke me down before the Lord. I cried to him, Lord, I take thee at thy word. Now thou knowest that I do search for thee with all my heart, that I have come here to pray to thee, and thou hast promised to hear me. Now, I'll break the story up here because after he goes out and prayed in the woods, he didn't have the visionary spiritual experience. He was just struck dumb. He was praying, crying out to God, asking what he should do, giving his life, giving his soul to God, seeking this real conversion here. But after that, he left the woods completely disappointed and basically unable to talk, unable to speak, unable to even think because he's so stressed out at this. And he returned to his office as a paralegal, and he waited for everybody to leave the office that evening before he returned to his prayers in hopes of this miraculous conversion in his stressed and open-minded mental state. He continues, quote, By evening, we got the books and furniture adjusted, and I made up in an open fireplace a good fire, hoping to spend the evening alone. Just at dark, Squire W., seeing that everything was adjusted, bade me good night and went to his home. I had accompanied him to the door, and as I closed the door and turned around, my heart seemed to be liquid within me. All my feelings seemed to rise and flow out, and the utterance of my heart was, I want to pour out my whole soul to God. The rising of my soul was so great that I rushed into the back room of the front office to pray. There was no fire and no light in the room. Nevertheless, it appeared to me as if it were perfectly light. As I went in and shut the door after me, it seemed as if I met the Lord Jesus Christ face to face. It did not occur to me then, nor did it for some time afterwards, that it was a wholly mental state. So there was no fire, there was no light in the room, but everything appeared to him as if it were perfectly light. He doesn't say as noonday sun, but he does say perfectly light, and that he met Jesus Christ face to face. But then he says that it was a wholly mental state. He says, On the contrary, it seemed to me that I saw him as I would see any other man. He said nothing, but looked at me in such a manner as to break me right down at his feet. I have always since regarded this as a most remarkable state of mind, for it seemed to me a reality, that he stood before me, and I fell down at his feet and poured out my soul to him. I wept aloud like a child, and made such confessions as I could with my choked utterance. It seemed to me that I bathed his feet with my tears, and yet I had no distinct impression that I touched him that I recollect. Should have tried to shake his hand, Charles Finney. I must have continued in this state for a good while, but my mind was too much absorbed with the interview to recollect anything that I said. Oh, meeting God was such a profound experience, you don't even remember what happened? Oh, weird. That seems pretty common among religious leaders, doesn't it? But I know as soon as my mind became calm enough to break off from the interview, I returned to the front office and found that the fire I had made of large wood was nearly burned out. But as I turned and was about to take a seat by the fire, I received a mighty baptism of the Holy Ghost. Without any expectation of it, without ever having the thought in my mind that there was any such thing for me, without any recollection that I had ever heard the thing mentioned by any person in the world, the Holy Spirit descended upon me in a manner that seemed to go through me, body and soul. I could feel the impression like a wave of electricity going through and through me. Indeed, it seemed to come in waves and waves of liquid love, for I could not express it in any other way. It seemed like the very breath of God. I can recollect distinctly that it seemed to fan me like immense wings. No words can express the wonderful love that was shed abroad in my heart. I wept aloud with joy and love, and I do not know, but I should say I literally bellowed out the unutterable gushings of my heart. These waves came over me and over me and over me, one after the other, until I recollect I cried out, "I shall die if these waves continue to pass over me." I said, "Lord, I cannot bear any more." Yet I had no fear of death. How long I continued in this state with this baptism continuing to roll over me and go through me, I do not know. End quote. You just gotta ride the trip out, man. You just ride it out. It'll all be over in a few hours. You'll be fine. And I know things seem really crazy right now, but you just keep riding it. You'll be all right. I read that because visionary and mystical conversion events like this are a dime a dozen in the burned over district in which Joe's theology and market scouting were formed. From that point forward, Charles Finney actually became a popular circuit rider preacher, debating universalists and holding very intense revivals, which included basically hot seats for anybody who was like teeming on the edge of conversion. Notably as well, that conversion story that I just read from Finney, that was recorded in 1868 in his autobiography, 47 years after it supposedly happened. But he'd obviously shared his conversion story in multiple public fora before writing it in his autobiography, right? So it's likely that during one of his revivals in Palmyra, where the young man Joe might have been attending, Finney shared his miraculous conversion story, details of which could have been lifted by Joe after he saw how successful of a preacher Finney was. Charles Finney had the following and the public clout that Joe wanted. Now, despite Joe's claims to have been disgusted by all of these revivals and the infighting, there's evidence that he participated in them at the time. Newspaper publisher Orsimus Turner, who knew Joe as a teenager, wrote that Joe caught, quote, "a spark of Methodism in the camp meeting away down in the woods on the Vienna Road, and that he was a very passable exhorter in the evening meetings," end quote. And Joe's neighbor, Peter Ingersoll, told his niece Sarah that, quote, "In the year 1822 or 23, Smith began preaching. He would hold meetings in the district schoolhouse and draw large crowds to hear him. He would preach for a while and then go into a trance and seemed to be perfectly conscious during this trance, and he would repeat some jargon in an unknown language. Then he would interpret the unknown sounds and assured those present that they were the pure Adamic language, the language in which Adam courted Eve in the Garden of Eden. Unknown tongue, preaching, uttering in this jargon that people can't understand, almost like he lifted those practices from Lumen Walters because it was at the same time that this was going on." Peter Ingersoll continues, "Strange as it may seem, he began to have believers, for at first it was done in a spirit of mischief and fun. After holding these meetings, Joe, as he was called, would come to Uncle Peter's house, if Uncle Peter was not with him, and tell him of the successes he had, how many converts he made, and laugh till he would drop on the floor with mirth," end quote. Okay, so now, right, so this is like a super late and it's a secondhand source, so who knows how reliable it is, but it suggests that Joe saw the power that revival preachers had over people and thought, I want some of that power. It's an intangible resource that leads to acquisition of more resources, right? And we see many elements that Joe incorporated into his church existing all around him, which were exhibited as enviable traits by those people that Joe likely admired, or for which he probably harbored some kind of jealousy, right? Whether it was Sally Chase and her seer stone that Joe used to find his own better than hers seer stone, or mumbling incoherent words and magic incantations that he picked up from Lumen Walters, or even like the first vision conversion story itself. All of these elements became integral ingredients to Joe's own story and church, and they all predate his stories. Now, like, Joe was an observant guy, right? And he could recognize what made people tick, what made people move and shake, and more importantly, what made people give their hard-earned resources to somebody else. So let's move from the New York era into the Kirtland period, once Joe's church had officially started. Now, a couple episodes ago, we talked about Joe's kind of like lust and desire for power, right? And all of the ways that he shut down other people when they gained too much power in his church. We discussed how Oliver Cowdery and Hiram Page, like, both received their own revelations in Fayette, New York in 1830. And then Joe ordered Hiram Page's seer stone destroyed and his revelations burned. Now, what bears repetition about these events is that Joe then sent Oliver Cowdery on a mission to the natives west of Missouri, while Joe remained behind and consolidated his leadership of the church. Now, it could be argued that there was some causality between these contemporary events. So when Cowdery and his mission companions headed to Missouri in 1830, they stopped in Kirtland, Ohio, and they converted a large Baptist commune along with its minister, Sidney Rigdon. Now, Rigdon was a bit of a straight-laced, good guy preacher, right? It had a bit of a tendency to also fall in and out of revolutionary, Freudian slip there, revelatory trances. It was possibly a product of like a head injury that he had with a horse riding accident when he was a young boy. Now, Joe had the ability to engage people one-on-one, and he was very persuasive in doing so, whereas Rigdon was a fantastic public speaker, an orator, and the masses unequivocally loved Rigdon. So the two men had very complementary skills. Joe needed a go-getter, and Hinchpin Rigdon fit the bill. Episodes 14, 15, 16, and 24, and also the Sunstone presentation on YouTube that's titled Sidney Rigdon, Forgotten Hero of Mormonism. Now, I should mention, there are two theories about Rigdon. One is that he had never heard of Joe or the Book of Mormon before, and that's the standard story and the one that most historians accept today. He came into the church by a happy accident of fate. The other is that Joe and Rigdon had met earlier in the 1820s, and Rigdon had collaborated with Joe in the Book of Mormon fraud. Now, that theory goes that sometime between 1818 to 1823, Hinchpin Rigdon stole a manuscript novel by a guy named Solomon Spaulding from a printing press in Pittsburgh. Rigdon edited the manuscript and he kept the work secret while he was working as a circuit preacher and making a name for himself after he had a falling out with his mentor, Alexander Campbell. In 1823, Rigdon met Joe while preaching at a revival in Rochester, New York, a mere 33 miles or, 1.5 days journey from Joe's hometown, Palmyra. Now, the two dudes get to know each other. They're two peas in a pod, right? And through various correspondences, they devise a plan to basically start a new Zionist or a new restorationist religion. Now, Rigdon shares the manuscript novel that he's been editing, and then Joe uses it as the basis for the Book of Mormon. Meanwhile, Rigdon goes back to Ohio and builds up a congregation that will be primed to accept this new scripture that Joe was writing. That Joe and Rigdon were writing, that Joe was putting the finishing touches on after Rigdon had basically put in all of the theology of it. Then in 1830, to keep the ruse going after the Book of Mormon is published, Hinchpin Rigdon sends Parley P. Pratt, one of his friends, to New York in order to meet with Joseph Smith and then lead some missionaries back to Kirtland in order to convert Rigdon's church. Now, the theory is a little convoluted, but there are some eyewitness accounts from people who claim to have seen Rigdon and Joe together in New York in the 1820s, and there are also strong similarities between the Book of Mormon and a draft version of Spaulding's novel that historians located in the 1880s. Now, I'm personally ambivalent about this theory, but it was one of the earliest explanations for how the Book of Mormon came to be, and there's no denying that this Spaulding-Rigdon authorship theory had a huge impact on how the American public perceived the church, and it had an impact on church leaders' decisions as well. And look, I'm personally happy to be swayed either way on the Spalding-Rigdon Book of Mormon authorship theory, and the simple fact remains that if the evidence that establishes the Spalding theory existed around literally any other book than the foundational Book of Mormon scripture, right? Most historians and objective students of history would very easily conclude that the Book of Mormon was plagiarized from Spalding's work, right? So that's to say, if any other 19th century book had as many accusations and evidence of plagiarism as the Book of Mormon, everybody would agree that it was plagiarized, but such a conclusion is inaccessible to the majority of people who study the Book of Mormon in early Mormon history, because to them, the Book of Mormon is the Word of God. How could the Word of God be plagiarized from another text? It's impossible, right? But with a number of sworn affidavits who claim such, the witness statements that placed Joe and Rigdon in the same place prior to 1830, the similarities between the discovered manuscript and the Book of Mormon, how the leadership dealt with the accusations via draconian excommunications, various legal battles, and then Joe's constant history of plagiarism in, once his church was actually started. And there are plenty of other elements, right? It leads many people to study the Spalding theory and come to conclusions that are counter to the consensus of historians. And the consensus is that Joe wrote the Book of Mormon, the sole authorship theory. But there's a small holdout that stick with the Spalding theory, right? It's considered a fringe theory, but and most historians today claim that the Spalding theory is dead. I disagree that it's dead. The consensus has created a social stigma in the Mormon history community around anybody who believes in the Spalding theory, and I think that stigma is a bit unwarranted. It's very, very complicated. Anyway, you can see my interview on Mormon Stories where I go through top to bottom a very high-level overview of the Spalding theory. Anyway, while Oliver Cowdery and the other missionaries continued their mission journey to Independence, Jackson County, Missouri, Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon and his friend Edward Partyboy Partridge decided to make a trip to Fayette, New York, where Joe was residing, to meet with him. And Joe and Rigdon clicked. 2 peas in a pod, 2 balls in a sack. And here we have a monumental shift in Mormon history. It was like a match made in heaven. From this moment on, Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon would become Joe's new favorite right-hand man, taking a special place in Joe's heart. Episode 24. Now, Rigdon brought with him to New York this other Kirtland resident, Edward Partyboy Partridge. Now, by this time, Joe had pretty much bled his first big bankroller, not so smarty Marty Harris, completely dry. Right? Like, Marty had mortgaged his farm to pay for printing of the Book of Mormon, and due to poor sales of the book, Marty was headed towards bankruptcy. And his wife had also divorced him and taken some of his assets during the settlement. So Joe needed a new wealthy mark, and Edward Partridge would be his first target. Rigdon brought that target right to Joe's doorstep. Now, Edward Partyboy Partridge was the grandson of Massachusetts Congressman Oliver Partridge. Now, back then, anybody that was in the government tended to also be a member of the upper crust of society, of course. Not much different today. So Edward came from a really rich family. Not only that, he also owned a hat making factory in Painesville, Ohio, just a few miles east of Kirtland. And that hat-making factory was actually really successful, and it made Edward one of the more affluent people in the area. Now, Eddie Partyboy Partridge also happened to have 2 daughters named Emily and Eliza, who were 7 and 10 years old when they first met their to-be husband, Joe, while he was in his late 20s. The people of Painesville, no doubt spurred by Rigdon as well, asked Edward Partridge to go with Rigdon to investigate Joe and the Book of Mormon, and Partridge became convinced. In fact, Joe happened to receive a revelation, the commodity of revelations for Partridge. Joe manufactured his own commodity, his own economy of revelations here. So he gave this specific revelation to Edward Partridge, which it doesn't say much in it except just to flatter him and tell Partridge that, his sins are forgiven, that he's called to preach the gospel and to commit himself to the church. Now, it's an awesome sales tactic, right? And it laid the groundwork for Joe to later move in on Partridge's wealth and daughters. Now, the first thing that a confidence man has to do is to gain the mark's confidence. And that's what this was. Once that confidence is established, The mark can be coerced into all sorts of things, especially when they are given an important role in the structure of the church. They are called on a mission by God, right? It's incredible how much coercive power resides in "thus saith the Lord." And we see a hint of Joe's intentions in his revelation to Edward Partridge, and it was later canonized in the Book of Commandments, chapter 39, which ordered Joe to move the New York church over to Kirtland in the first of many Mormon exoduses. Quote, "And now I give unto the church in these parts a commandment, that certain men among them shall be appointed to look to the poor and needy, and to govern the affairs of the property of this church. And if ye seek the riches, which it is the will of the Father to give unto you, ye shall be the richest of all people, for ye shall have the riches of eternity. And it must needs be that the riches of the earth is mine to give." End quote. Look at that. Joe came up with revelations that told people that they would essentially have to give support to the poor and the needy. That sounds really great, doesn't it? Charity never faileth. Guess who was poor and needy at this time? None other than the prophet himself. But then that revelation actually takes a turn when it says that the people will be appointed to govern the property of the church, and that will be their work. So basically, Joe is laying the groundwork for his religio-communist economic system 3 years before the United Order that he created, the actual communist system of Mormonism, was officially formed. And then the revelation says that the people who follow this church will have their earthly riches taken away from them, because they're on loan, right? They'll be given the riches of eternity instead. And that final verse is the most chilling of all. It must needs be that the riches of the earth is mine to give. So Joe will be the one responsible for distributing the riches of the earth, because those riches are his to give. Well, God's, right? God's, but like Joe's the mouthpiece of God. He's also like the record keeper of God, the ledger book guy of God, the booker of God, the tiller of God, the coin purse of God, the hand of God. Like Joe he's God, right? He is God here, right? So how this was all implemented was that just, it's a little more complicated than Joe just like controlling all of the assets of all of the Mormons, but that's how it was put into practice. But the impetus and motivation behind it is very simple. Joe sees a whole bunch of prospective marks in Kirtland, and he tells them, as the mouthpiece of Almighty God, to give all of their property to him, and they did it. Like, the coercive nature of this revelation is remarkable, and it's patternistic for Joe's entire ministry, right? The property that the people have isn't actually theirs, it's God's. And God was nice enough to bless them with it for a time. God is loaning them their possessions. Now give all of that stuff back to God, and he's going to bless you in eternity for it. Like, people ask if Joseph Smith actually believed what he said, and I think revelations like this illustrate that he knew exactly what he was doing, and has absolutely no bearing on whether or not he really believed himself to be the mouthpiece of God's. He knew what he was doing. And then, so Joe travels to Kirtland with Hinchpin Rigdon and Edward Partridge with Emma, and when he arrives, when Emma and Joe arrive there, Joe is welcomed into the home of Newell K. Whitney, Father Newell K. Whitney, as we called him a long time ago in the historical timeline. Now, here we have Joe's second affluent target for exploitation in Kirtland. Now, while Edward Party Boy Partridge was a good guy to have around, he kind of just sort of abandoned his wealth and then liquidated his assets in order to become the first bishop of the church in Kirtland and give all of his assets to the church. Joe needed an active business to leech off of in order to stay alive, right? Like, those one-time donations are really nice to run on for a little while. They just aren't sustainable in the way that like recurring smaller donations are. Patreon.com/Naked Mormonism. So Joe decided to parasitically latch onto the Whitney family and moved into the upstairs apartment above Newell Whitney's merchandise shop known as N.K. Whitney and Company. The building has been recreated in downtown Kirtland today. It's owned by the church, and that would soon become the very first bishop's storehouse for the church and the place where Joe and Emma would live for over 2 years in Kirtland. Now, Joe was basically made king of Kirtland upon his arrival. Eventually, all of the town's commodities were transferred to him to decide who would receive what. The missionary force for the church was running smoothly with new people headed to new places all across the country constantly, right? Like, the people in Kirtland liked Joe for the most part. The new hadn't worn off him yet, and the ones that didn't were effectively ostracized from the community. 3 days after arriving in Kirtland, Joe received this incredible revelation, which became Book of Commandments, chapter 43. Quote, "He that receiveth my law and doeth it the same is my disciple. And he that saith he receive it and doeth it not, the same is not my disciple, and shall be cast out from among you. For it is not meet that the things which belong to the children of the kingdom should be given to them that are not worthy, or to dogs, or the pearls to be cast before swine. And again, it is meet that my servant Joseph should have a house built in which to live and translate." End quote. How do Mormons read that chapter and that verse and not be like, well, he's just a money grubbing dick, right? Like, how do you read that and be like, no, these are the words of God? It's so craven. It's so brazenly and transparently corrupt. I speak for God. God is telling me to tell you to give me all your stuff. And if you don't believe that God actually told you that stuff, then you're not my real disciple and get out of here. And anybody who says that they are, but don't give me their stuff, they're dogs. They're pearls to be cast before swine. And also, I don't let me forget this. Y'all go build me a damn house. Build me a house. How do people read this and still be like, no, Joe, he's a prophet. Yeah, no, polygamy is an issue, but no, otherwise, he's a real good guy. It's like, it's amazing to me. Like, the town essentially gave everything that it had to Joe. He came out with a revelation saying that anybody who follows him is a disciple of Jesus. Anybody that doesn't is a muddy dog who's going to be cast out from among you, speaking to the true believers, right? And then he tops it all off with this commandment, build me a house, because apparently the free living arrangement, the apartment above the bishop's storehouse, just wasn't good enough for him to live with. Joe always wants more, and he never is satisfied to have anybody else be richer or more powerful than he is, right? He couldn't just let a rich man be rich. When I say man, of course, like in the time, women couldn't like legally even own property. They got dresses. Good on them. Yay. You get to own dresses. Lucky you. But like, Joe had to socialize in Kirtland era specifically. That's where it began. He had to socialize the rich man's wealth and then just dole some of that wealth back to the rich man as a show of generosity by God's one true servant. Like, what can't be accomplished when you got God in your corner, when God is on your side, right? Like, and this structure also has a way of self-selecting only the most credulous to give their time and material wealth to the church, right? Those who are not deluded enough to give up their stuff, they don't give up their stuff, right? And so those who are deluded enough to give up their stuff, they give up their stuff. And time only for just like the requirements of the church to be increasingly heaped upon their shoulders. The more that you give to the church, the more that the church asks from you. It's a pattern from Joe's early church that perpetuates in the modern iterations as well. It's quite disturbing. And hey, look, I'm not an anti-socialist. It's just when this person is saying, God told me to give me all of your property, and people do it, I got a problem with that. Okay? So, like, when Joe got to Kirtland, he also found out that a prophetess named Laura Hubble had been producing revelations in the Kirtland church that was operating prior to his arrival. Now, I told the story a couple episodes ago, but it bears examination from kind of a different vantage point today. Joe was really jealous of his tenuous grasp on power, especially in the very, very early Kirtland era when that grasp was far less secure than it was like in Missouri or in Nauvoo. So any person who presented a possible threat to his leadership structure needed to be immediately neutralized, lest they arise to power and wrestle some of that power from Joe's envious money-grabbing fists. So Laura Hubble presented a crucial case of jealousy for power, because how dare a woman say that she has powers that are reserved only for the penis, only for the priesthood and the prophet himself, right? Well, let's see how Joe handled this situation. And unfortunately, we don't have the revelations that Laura Hubble gave, as far as my research told me anyway. No copy of these prophecies is extant, but we can always read the revelation that Joe gave in response to her revelation and try to tease out what her revelations were about. This is from Book of Commandments, chapter 45. Quote, For behold, verily, verily, I say unto you, that ye have received a commandment for a law unto my church, through him whom I have appointed unto you, power play, to receive commandments and revelation from my hand. And this ye shall know assuredly, that there is none other appointed unto you to receive commandments and revelations, until he be taken, if he abide in me. But verily, verily, I say unto you, that none else shall be appointed unto this gift, except it be through him. For if it be taken from him, he shall not have power, except to appoint another in his stead. Such a powerful power play. We're going to talk about it in a second here. And this shall be a law unto you, that ye receive not the teachings of any that shall come before you as revelations or commandments. And this I give unto you, that you may not be deceived, that you may know they are not of me. End quote. So that was 6 verses worth of Joe screaming at everybody to listen to him and ignore anybody else that claims to be giving divine revelation from God, because he's the only one that can ever do that, ever. And anybody else who claims to have those powers is obviously lying or deceived by Satan. And there's also another interesting aspect to that power play in that passage there. Only Joe can give revelations, and if he fails in his office as prophet, only he can name a successor. So what if the people believe that he's a fallen prophet? He'll be the only one to tell them if they're right. And who's responsible for placing him after he's a fallen prophet? He is, of course. It's like, this would be like a president who habitually flaunts the law, using the Department of Justice as his own system to just cover up for his own crimes. Like, imagine what kind of a world that would leave, or what kind of a religion that would create. Imagine the corruption. Jealousy is an ugly look, especially when it's jealousy of one's own power. Episodes 25 and 28. Now, the revelation then goes on to say what the church should do with Mrs. Laura Hubble and what it should do with Joe. Quote, Purge ye out the iniquity which is among you. Sanctify yourselves before me, and if ye desire the glories of the kingdom, appoint ye my servant Joseph, and uphold him before me by the prayer of faith. And again, I say unto you, that if ye desire the mysteries of the kingdom, provide for him food and raiment. It's just so transparent. Provide for him food and raiment and whatsoever thing he needeth to accomplish the work wherewith I have commanded him. It's just, it is so transparent. Joe just gave commandments to his followers to build a home for him and to support him with donations, whether they be money or actual physical commodities, all while he made a power play to make sure that everybody followed him and only him as prophet. And it's one of those self-selecting things. Anybody who doesn't believe him, they leave. Only the people who stay in the church take this. They swallow this bitter pill. Now, he also couldn't tolerate any hint that someone else might be able to access the mysteries of God, right? That was his job. What would you say you do around here, Joe? Well, I give the people the mysteries of the kingdom. That's all he had. That's all he could do. That was his only skill, right? And Joe, it's because if other people could access those mysteries, like Joe's way of life, like his comfortable and privileged position in this parasitic lifestyle would be threatened. We can't have that. And Joe occasionally tried to let other people have some level of power so that they could do work and of leadership and then he could relax a little bit. But in the end, his envy always kicked in and he put people in their place, whether they were Miss Hubble or Hiram Page or Oliver Cowdery or later on David Whitmer, his own wife Emma, William Law, William Clayton, Thomas B. Marsh, Sidney Rigdon, Samson Avard, or anybody else who posed a threat or became a little too ambitious for Joe to be able to control those people. And since we're talking about Joe's smackdown of Laura Hubble, this is probably a good place to talk about how Joe never let any women have any significant power in the church. And we're going to discuss this a little bit more at the end of the show here. So I want to read from a passage written by Susan Staker's chapter in the book Writing Mormon History, which is an anthology, recently released anthology edited by the friend of the show, Joseph Geisner. And in her chapter, she says that Joe's scriptures were, quote, a profoundly homosocial economy with seers, angels, and gods, all men. Joseph's textual economy, the economy of Revelations, she's talking about it too. Joseph's textual economy rarely attends to personalized female characters. Within the Book of Mormon, women are members of groups, mothers, daughters, sisters, murderers. Joseph's revelations rarely mention women, mostly the children in relation to ordinances of baptism or sacrament. Only one of the revelations printed in the Doctrine and Covenants is addressed to a woman, the elect lady revelation to Emma Hale, Joseph's own first wife. Women finally captured Joseph's attention within the 1835 Egyptian project. Zip Z is... it's from the Egyptian language that Joe was translating. It's just a word he came up with. Zip Z is one of the terms in Joseph's initial Egyptian alphabet document from July 1835. He translates it as woman, married or unmarried, or daughter. Within the bound Egyptian grammar and alphabet, this term elaborated along with its degrees is associated with all women and with the first woman who was Eve. Woman signals under or beneath, second in right or in authority or government. With a focus on the fecundity of women, this term can also be used to note increasing or decreasing degrees of importance and a fruitful place or fruitful vine. With this term, women are underscored as wives and mothers and second in relation to their men. In Nauvoo, Joseph dictates Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, the revelation on plural marriage. The revelation dictated by Joseph at Hiram's request never directly addresses Emma. Rather, she is a subject of conversation between the God voice and Joseph, end quote. So there's a lot to unpack there. I recommend you pick up a copy of Writing Mormon History and read the whole chapter for yourself. It's truly remarkable. And there are a lot of really incredible chapters within that book. When we were talking about Emma last, 5-6 episodes ago, and talking about Linda Newell and Val Avery's writing Mormon Enigma, the biography of Emma, right? It's a really fantastic book, and it gives you a really good finger on the pulse of all of the forces at play in the field of Mormon history. But there's also a lot to unpack in just the passage that we discussed there. But the bottom line is that Susan Staker is saying Joe's revelations hardly ever mention women, and when they do mention women, it's always as subordinates of men or done so to ensure compliance and subservience to the men as their helpmeets, as their mothers of their children, and so on and so forth. Women are treated more as property than as human beings who can make choices or exercise authority in the church. Now, this comes into incredibly sharp focus when we consider the polygamy revelation, but that's going to have to wait for now in our series here. Check out episodes 148 and 149, though. However, in a footnote of Susan Staker's chapter, she goes so far to say that, quote, Joseph comes to gather other men, his friends and the friends of God, under the sign of the seer, end quote. Mormon salvation is for men, not for women. In fact, as we'll soon find out, part of how Mormon men achieve salvation is by collecting women like they're pogs. Any other millennial listeners out there? You all get into pogs when you were kids? Anyway, whatever. Episode 158. I'm getting way ahead of myself here. Let's focus back into the Kirtland era here. On August 23rd, 1834, a guy named Sylvester Smith brought charges against Joe in the High Council. Now, we don't know exactly what the charges are, but they had to do with the Zion's Camp March to Missouri, which was an absolute fiasco, and we're going to have to discuss that in another one of the upcoming episodes in our series here, episodes 30, 31, and 32. The High Council investigated the charges raised by Sylvester Smith and concluded in the meeting minutes, quote, that we are satisfied with his, Joe's, conduct, having learned from the clearest evidence that he has acted in every respect worthy of his high and responsible station in the church, and has prudently and cautiously preserved the good of this society at large, and is worthy of our esteem and fellowship, and that those reports could have originated in the minds of none except such as either from a natural misunderstanding or natural jealousy are easily led to conceive of evils where none exist, end quote. I'm not jealous, you are. So the High Council totally exonerated Joe here, and they chalked up the allegations made by Sylvester Smith to a misunderstanding or to jealousy. But by the time this hearing was conducted, Joe's inner circle of church leadership was staffed so exclusively with cronies who would never contradict the prophet of God that they could do nothing but find no wrongdoing or illegal acts on Joe's part. But Joe wouldn't take these allegations from Sylvester Smith lying down and had to react in a similar fashion. So 5 days later, quote, the High Council assembled according to the direction of Bishop Whitney, Newell K. Whitney, Father Whitney, to try Brother Sylvester Smith charged with a misdemeanor, end quote. The misdemeanor? He continued to badmouth the prophet, even after Joe had been exonerated by the council. It's punitive at this point, but did we expect Joe to act in any other way, right? As soon as Joe was charged for doing something unbecoming of a prophet of God, he would then manufacture allegations against the person that charged him in the first place, right? This was an early manifestation of a strong pattern that developed of Joe's coordinated character assassination campaigns against enemies or anybody who's a trusted elite who would say anything negative about him, right? It's a classic case of misdirection, and it worked because the leadership of the church obviously sided with the infallible and pious supreme leader, right? Even the one and only true mouthpiece and servant of our Heavenly Father, Joseph Smith Jr. It's corruption and it's protectionism at its worst, the religious kind of protectionism. Here's a long list of episodes, but factors into all of these episodes: 39, 49, 51, 54, 58, 76, 77, 91, 94, 98, 109, 116, 117, the whole Bennett Meltdown series. It's episodes 120 through 134, 140, 146, 156, 171, 178, 179, 197, 198, 199, 200, 201, 204, and episode 213. So, now, Let's skip ahead to another much larger revolt against Joe's leadership in 1837 and 1838. We've discussed Joe's scheme to build a Mormon bank a lot on the show. It's kind of an important time in Mormon history, right? The bank, of course, it blew up, right? And like, not literally, but like the way that, corporations blow up by collapsing on the shows, right? So it blew up, it collapsed, it imploded, and a lot of people involved in it completely lost all their life savings. But even before the bank failed, there started to be pushback. According to Wilford Woodruff's journal, this is Willie Goat Wilford, right? On January 17th, 1837, just 11 days after the bank put its first money into circulation, D-Day David Whitmer lectured to the 70s and, quote, warned us to humble ourselves before God, lest his hand rest upon us in anger for our pride and many sins, that we were running into our days of prosperity as the ancient Nephites did, end quote. The Canary, 11 days after the Kirtland Safety Society anti-bank company started issuing money, just 11 days after, the Canary was beginning to wobble on its perch. Now, a month later, after Joe had been out of town for a couple weeks, he returned to find that, quote, many were stirred up in their hearts, as some were against him, as the Israelites were against Moses. But when he arose in the power of God in their midst, as Moses did anciently, they were put to silence, for the complainers saw that he stood in the power of a prophet. Oh, how weak is man, end quote. Side note, it's surprising that Joe hearkened to Moses instead of Moroni or Helaman or Nephi or Alma or Nephi, but, it's a side note, right? But for the moment, after he got back into Kirtland and there's a lot of strife, a lot of murmuring going on, Joe had things under control. And as we discussed last episode, like Kirtland Mormonism hit a high point of euphoria with a drunken and possibly hallucinogenic party in honor of the anniversary of the Kirtland Temple dedication on March 23rd, 1837. But the mood shifted fast after that anniversary celebration because right around that same time, Andrew Jackson kicked off the Panic of 1837 by cracking down on private banks as he was leaving office. It was one of the last things that he signed before leaving office was the Specie Circular. Now, because of Andrew Jackson's last screw you to the whole American continent, really, and to all the Western countries that were heavily reliant on American exports, there was a run on banks all over the country and all over Western societies. And Kirtland was no exception here. Episode 38. More than half of the banks across the country folded, and specie in the form of gold and silver became a precious commodity. By early April, Willie Goat Wilford Woodruff wrote in his journal that Smith lectured to the elders' quorum that if the elders would just obey him for once, quote, Kirtland should speedily be redeemed and become a stronghold not to be thrown down. Joseph presented us in some degree the plot of the city of Kirtland, which is the stronghold of the daughter of Zion, as it was given him by vision. It was great, marvelous, and glorious. The city extended to the east, west, north, and south. Steamboats will come puffing into the city. Our goods will be conveyed upon railroads from Kirtland to many places, and probably to Zion, meaning Missouri. Houses of worship will be reared unto the Most High. Beautiful streets were to be made for the saints to walk in. Kings of the earth would come to behold the glory thereof, and many glorious things not now to be named would be bestowed upon the saints. But all these things are better imagined than spoken by the children of Jacob. End quote. Did that seem desperate at all? Like, Joe was up on the stand showing everybody plans that he had drawn out from a fever dream, apparently, for Kirtland and how great it's gonna be if they only have some faith in the Kirtland Safety Society company, because he's got a plan, and they bring more people to the church. Or just their money, right? Like, the people themselves don't even need to come, just bring their money, right? Like, Joe had a penchant for grand plans that were just laughably ambitious and frankly impossible. He thought that Kirtland would become a major industrial center and it'd make him very wealthy. He thought the same for Missouri, and all the plans fell through after the Mormons were forcibly removed from the state. Only in Nauvoo did his grand plans nearly come to fruition, but every project that was started was so ill-fated and underfunded and poorly managed to begin with that it would never become what he dreamed that it could be and actually take advantage of its location on the Mississippi, the largest shipping river in America at the time. Now, the thing is, Joe had visited New York City, Boston, Washington, D.C., and plenty of other large cities in his time. It's very clear that he wanted to be king of his own metropolitan American city. Had he survived through 1844, who knows what, if that dream may have been realized and how American history would have been influenced. But that's, of course, speculative, fictional history. By May of 1837, this is just, 5 months into the Kirtland Safety Society circulating money, there was so much discontent among the leaders of the church that 2 apostles, Orson and Parley Pratt, brothers, filed charges against Joe in the High Council, quote, for lying and misrepresentation, also for extortion, and for speaking disrespectfully against his brethren behind their backs, end quote. Extortion. They charged him with extortion. How amazing would it be if we could charge religious leaders with extortion today? Well, I mean, this is not a legal case. It's High Council, right? This is the religious, theocratic sort of pseudo-legal court system, tribunal system that Joe had set up. It essentially functioned as, policing, the church policing itself. And when corporations police themselves, we can trust them, right? Apostle Luke Johnson at this time also filed charges against Joe, quote, for closing the doors of the house of the Lord against the High Council, end quote. And the same day, Joe's scribe, Warren Parrish, filed charges against Hinchman Sidney Rigdon, quote, for expressing an unbelief in the revelations of God, both old and new, also an unbelief in the agency of man and his accountability to God, or that there is such a principle existing as sin, and also for lying and declaring that God required it at his hands, end quote. Who knows what was really said and what Rigdon really said at that time and what the argument really was with Warren Parrish, though. We're going to talk a little bit more about Warren Parrish in just a second, but that's a loaded charge. But also among the dissenters were other apostles, Lyman Johnson and John F. Boynton, who Lyman Johnson would eventually become Leadfoot Lyman Johnson. Now, a few points worth consideration here. This tension among the leadership, the apostles and the prophet and the presidency and all of the High Council and everybody, that's a result of many factors, right? It wasn't just the Kirtland Safety Society, but the Fanny Alger incident had cast Joe's piety deeply into question, as it was publicly discussed and widely known. The overwhelming debt that the church had incurred, which resulted in the formation of the Kirtland Safety Society Company, that remained unpaid. Creditors were beating down the doors of nearly every member of the Mormon leadership, but Joe had just tied up all of their wealth and assets in the Kirtland Safety Society Company, and the money just simply dried up and it's gone, leaving everybody unable to pay their personal debts. And then, of course, the treasure-seeking trip to Massachusetts was a total failure, egg on Joe's face. Dissent was openly contended in public church meetings, not just in the High Council, but of the broader membership, in public Sunday school meetings. And nobody likes a display of dirty laundry, but when all of the laundry is dirty, it's kind of hard to turn a blind eye to it. And then, of course, not so smarty Marty Harris had just declared in a Sunday meeting that he saw the gold plates with the spiritual eye instead of the natural eye, the way that he sees a city through a mountain, right? And that cast all of Joe's claims of divinity and the history of the Book of Mormon into question. And then, of course, the Spalding theory, resulting from multiple exposés and scathing newspaper articles claiming that the Book of Mormon was plagiarism from a dead guy's novel. That was gaining a ton of traction. And Ebert E. Howe had published thousands of copies of Mormonism Unveiled that established the basis for the Spalding theory. That was gaining a ton of traction. And missionaries across the nation were being confronted with questions that they couldn't answer. So there's just a lot of factors that are going into what happened in Kirtland here. By September 4th, 1837, the Kirtland Safety Society had completely failed, and Joe and Rigdon had resigned from the Kirtland Safety Society, and they'd been placed in their positions, a couple of fall guys for it. But like Joe had also, by this time, rallied enough of the church's membership around himself in order to have like the dissenters' apostleship revoked. So in March the following year, 1838, after he had excommunicated all of those dissenters, all of those apostles, and they effectively formed their own church and excommunicated him from it, the following March, Joe also excommunicated Ollie Cowdery, D.A. David Whitmer, John Goebbels Whitmer, and William Wines Doubledub Phelps, who by this time, those people had all joined the dissenters. The charges brought against them in the excommunication trial were mostly fabricated, so much so that Oliver Cowdery later spent years negotiating with Brigham Young to have those false excommunication charges expunged from his record before he would return to the church that Brigham Young was building out in Utah. Unfortunately, Cowdery died an untimely death before he went to Utah. So that sucks. Joe even accused the dissenters of continuing to pass worthless Kirtland Safety Society bills on to people as if those people were the ones behind all of the predatory banking all along. No, you did it. No, you committed fraud. No, you did counterfeiting. It's amazing. So like Joe, at the end of the dissent in Kirtland, Joe may have won the will of the people and the bureaucratic fight for control of the church, but the dissenters won the legal and physical fight for control of the city. Now, apparently things got so hot that at one point, Warren Parrish burst into the temple with a cabal of his dissenters, and they held the church's leadership at gunpoint. And a scuffle ensued and legal charges were filed. And on another occasion, Bloody Brigham Young even warned Joe that there was a plot to assassinate him brewing in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. It's amazing. Like, these things don't happen because Joe was a persecuted prophet. These things happen because Joe was a horrible human being, right? Joe ended up fleeing Kirtland in the middle of the night and going to Missouri. Episodes 39, 40, and 41. Now, when Joe arrived in Missouri on March 14th, 1838, quote, "Many of the brethren came out to meet us, who also with open arms welcomed us to their bosoms. We were immediately received under the hospitable roof of Brother George W. Harris, who treated us with all possible kindness, and we refreshed ourselves with much satisfaction after our long and tedious journey." End quote. All right. Pro tip for anybody who might be thinking about letting Joe stay in your house. Don't first, or if you do, hide your wife and daughters. According to several sources, George W. Harris's wife, Lucinda Pendleton Morgan Harris, became Joseph Smith's first polyandrous plural wife. Now, polyandrous, of course, means that she was married to more than one husband at the same time. Now, we're going to do a deep dive into polygamy on an upcoming episode of this 10-part series here, but you can't talk about Joe's aspirations for wealth of commodities without discussing the fact that he secretly married about a dozen women were already married to other women. Now, I don't know how to understand this except as a product of Joe's jealousy of his bro's hot wives, right? Now, of course, apologists are going to try to tell us that, maybe Joe never had sex with any of these women. Maybe his true goal was to create dynastic ties and a levirate type of relationships to keep people and their husbands and tie everybody together in this large celestial family or some other nonsense, right? Okay, but if Joe had wanted to be sealed to the husbands, he could have just invented celestial gay marriage, but he didn't. So can we just be honest at this point and say that Joe's libido was a driving factor in his revelations? If Joe were using plural marriage to forge closer ties with the women's husbands, then maybe he should have waited until Orson Hyde returned from his mission instead of marrying his wife while he was out on the mission. Am I right? No. We're going to talk about Orson Hyde and his wife's story in just a second here. But first, let's deal with Lucinda Harris. Lucinda was the widow of the infamous William Morgan, who published his expose of Masonry in 1826 and then went missing really soon afterwards while in the custody of Masons. Now, this very public William Morgan affair, disappearing issue, this whole thing happened right in Joe's backyard in New York. Now, Lucinda became a Mormon and remarried to George W. Harris. During the 2 months that Joe and Emma lived with the Harrises, Joe courted Lucinda and took her as a plural wife. Even in a dire time when his life was threatened and the church was collapsing around him and he was bumming a bed to sleep in from one of his friends, Joe found the time to court a new wife in the same household as he, Emma, and the kids and her husband were living in. Now, the historical record can't prove whether or not Emma was aware of this relationship. Biographers claim that she was completely oblivious to the majority of Joe's wives, and there's no way to unequivocally prove otherwise. I'm going to leave it at this. Emma's knowledge and participation in polygamy is a heated subject of debate and speculation in the Mormon history community. Now, unfortunately, we don't know many details of this marriage. This is from Todd Compton's book, In Sacred Loneliness. Quote, "There is no firm date for Smith's marriage to Lucinda, but these 2 months, while the Smiths were living in the Harris home, are a good possibility. He often married women while he was living in the same house with them, and the Sarah Pratt statement correlates with the year 1838 as well. Smith was 32 at the time, and Lucinda was 36, so he was the first of her husbands who was not an older man. George Harris may have given permission for the marriage, since he was a close friend of Smith and a church leader. He later stood proxy for Smith in the Nauvoo Temple, as his wife was sealed to the dead prophet for eternity." Despite the prophet's connection to Lucinda, she would not stop living with George, as was customary in Smith's polyandrous marriages. End quote. So, whatever the exact circumstances of the marriage, this set a precedent for celestial polyandry, allowing Joe to acquire a lot of his friends' hot wives after the church moved to Nauvoo. Now, as much as women were commodities in this Victorian era, Joe couldn't see a possession somebody else had, a most treasured possession that somebody else had, without wanting it for himself. And it's a really good thing that society has evolved past that. Am I right? So in the aftermath of the Missouri Mormon War of 1838, the Mormons lost the war and they surrendered to the Missourians. In November of 1838, Joe was interred in Liberty Jail with his brother Hiram Smith, several other church leaders, Caleb Baldwin, Alexander McCrae, Lyman White. Meanwhile, most of the Mormons were expelled from Missouri and moved as refugees north to Quincy, Illinois, across the Mississippi. Now, Joe's absence threatened his power, his most precious and jealously guarded possession. He was afraid of what Hinchpin Rigdon would do as soon as he got to Quincy without Joe there to naysay him or keep him reined in. Now, Rigdon was released from Liberty Jail 2 months before the prophet, and Joe had no way of ensuring Hinchpin Rigdon wouldn't step in to fill the power vacuum. But fortunately for Joe, senior apostle Bloody Brigham Young stepped in to operate as president in Joe's absence, which is good because at this time, Brigham Young was very loyal, and he was also an awesome businessman who could coordinate the resettlement of thousands of destitute Mormon refugees. Episode 54. This time during the early organization of the Illinois settlements, this is actually when Rigdon developed a healthy new respect and fear for who Bloody Brigham was starting to become. Now, Brigham purged the leadership and put his own guy, Wilford Woodruff, into the quorum. This is the same Wilford Woodruff, Willie Go Wilford, who would become the third prophet of the Brighamite Church. Now, in addition, Brigham kept a tight set of reins on the other members of the leadership, making sure that Joe would be happy with Brigham's work upon his return. At the March 1839 General Conference, quote, it was unanimously voted that the following persons be excommunicated from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, viz. George M. Hinkle, Samson Avard, John Correll, Reed Peck, William Wines Phelps, Frederick G. Williams, Freddie G. Willie, Thomas B. Marsh, Burr Riggs, and several others, end quote. It's from the History of the Church, Volume 3. Now, Bloody Brigham took this conference as an opportunity to cleanse the leadership, to excommunicate almost every person who testified against the leadership of the church during the November 1838 Court of Inquiry into Mormon treason during the Missouri Mormon War, episode 50. Now, if a mafia family is filled with rats, it's time to go on extermination patrol. And that's exactly what Bloody Brigham Young did. So Joe actually had no idea that this purge happened until after he busted out of the joint by bribing his guards with whiskey and a healthy chunk of change. Now, Rigdon wasn't even present for this conference. Joe had told them explicitly to not hold any conferences until he could get there, which is an absurd and asinine thing to say because, of course, the Mormons are going to need to hold a conference to figure out just what the hell they're going to do with 10,000 refugees moving into a dinky little swampland on the Illinois banks of the Mississippi. The point I'm getting at here is Joe legitimately feared for his position as head of the Mormon movement, while he didn't know how long he would remain caught up in the cogs of the Missouri legal machine. Maybe the Mormons wouldn't miss him in his absence. So Bloody Brigham took the charge, and he handled business as it needed to be handled. And eventually, Joe bribed his way out of jail, and he escaped to Illinois, where he took over the reins of the church beginning in the spring of 1839. Nauvoo, well, as it was before it was named Nauvoo, Commerce, Illinois was a clean slate for the Mormons and for Joe. Well, he spent the last 3 years on this podcast in the historical timeline talking about how Joe manipulated Illinois politics in order to increase his own power and influence and to create a religious theocracy free from any legal oversight. Here, Joe's greatest fantasies and dreams could become reality. And I think it's important to recognize something about his time in Nauvoo because I feel we can learn a lot from this exercise. What powerful figures did Joe envy? Whose power did Joe want to emulate? I mean, who did he view as men who'd accomplished more than him that he wanted to mimic? Well, while Joe was sitting in Liberty Jail, the state of Missouri was out collecting evidence to be used against him in his actual jury trial for treason, right? Like the November Court of Inquiry just passed down an indictment that kept him in jail until they could collect, the state itself could collect all of the evidence they needed for an actual official jury trial. Now, one of the pieces of evidence that they collected was an affidavit from Apostle Thomas B. Marsh, the milk strippings guy, the prodigal son of the Utah Mormon Kingdom, who said this, quote, I have heard the prophets say that he should yet tread down his enemies and walk over their dead bodies. That if he was not let alone, he would be a second Muhammad to this generation, and that he would make it one gore of blood from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean. That like Muhammad, whose motto entreating for peace was the Al-Quran or the sword, so should it eventually be with us, Joe Smith or the sword, end quote. Notably, Thomas B. Marsh was a member of the Danites, Joe's secret shadow hit squad at the time. He was privy to the conversations of Joe saying he would be a second Muhammad to this generation. Thing is, Muhammad was a warlord. Like, the guy probably killed thousands of people, and Joe wanted to be a great man like Muhammad. And if that meant killing every non-Mormon in America to build Zion, the Mormon Mecca, then that's what Joe was willing to do. Interestingly enough, many newspapers would call Joe the Mormon Muhammad when reporting about his military expeditions in Missouri and the raising of his Nauvoo Legion throughout the entire history of Nauvoo Mormonism. And he almost seems to have worn that label as a badge of honor. After escaping jail and going to Illinois, Joe compared himself to another brutal leader on July 3rd, 1841. According to Tom Ass Sharp, I say Tom Ass Sharp because Joe's younger brother, Crazy Willie Smith, published his paper, The Wasp, and anytime that he responded to articles that were published by Thomas Sharp in the Warsaw Signal, he would say Tom Ass. He would capitalize ASS, Tom Ass Sharp. So clever, Crazy Willie. You're as good at nicknames as me, buddy. So according to Tom Ass Sharp, and he's the newspaper editor who founded the anti-Mormon party, and he printed the Warsaw Signal. Joe gave a speech in which he warned the anti-Mormons, quote, that if they did not stop their blab about him, he would be president of the United States. This is printed in 1841, like 3 years before he actually ran for president, right? God would give him the office he wanted, and then he would show them what a Bonaparte could do, end quote. Napoleon Bonaparte, of course, was a French emperor who had embroiled Europe in a series of brutal wars and established the first French Empire, right? Bonaparte was another badge of honor for Joe. During a dinner meeting, this is from Mormon Enigma, quote, Joseph remarked to William Phelps, Double Dub Phelps, that he had a kind, provident wife who would load the table with good things to eat until the sight destroyed his appetite, when all he had asked her for was a little bread and milk. Emma came into the room in time to hear Phelps say, you must do as Bonaparte did. Have a little table just large enough for the victuals you want yourself. With tact born of experience, Emma replied, Mr. Smith is a bigger man than Bonaparte. He can never eat without his friends. That is the wisest thing I ever heard you say, Joseph commented, end quote. That's another real gem that Joe envied, right? And Bonaparte famously boasted to the Austrian statesman Metternich, you cannot stop me. I spend 30,000 lives a month. That's a quote. So the people Joe aspired to imitate were military tyrants who conquered and subjugated massive swaths of the world. This is who we sing praise to every Sunday. This is the humble man that God chose to be his mouthpiece. Well, you know what? Let's discuss one polygamy story here, because I think this highlights the covetous theme of this episode pretty well. Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde. Smith Hyde. Miranda Nancy Johnson first met Joe while she was living with her parents in her parents' home in 1831. Quite a pattern when it came to Joe's later wives, but this is where the pattern began, right? She was 16 at that time. That's probably when she first caught Joe's eye, episode 26. 3 years later, in 1834, Miranda married Orson Hyde, who would become one of Joe's 12 apostles. Now, fast forward to Nauvoo, April 1840, Joe sent Orson Lahaidem on a mission to England and to Israel, which would keep him away for 2 years. That gave Joe plenty of time to work on Miranda. On December 2nd, 1841, Joe asked Ebenezer and Angeline Robinson to house Miranda and her kids until Orson returned. On that same day, Joseph received a revelation commanding Miranda to obey, quote, the counsel of my servant Joseph in all things, end quote. And a note in Joe's diary indicates that he married her 4 months later. According to George D. Smith's book, Nauvoo Polygamy, quote, a year following Smith's hearken to Joseph in all things revelation to Miranda, Orson Hyde returned from his 2.5-year mission to Jerusalem, Europe, and Asia. His return was noted in Smith's diary on December 7th, 1842, when Smith had dinner with the Hydes. Soon, Joseph told Orson about plural marriage, since Hyde was reportedly, quote-unquote, furious, perhaps accentuated by Joseph's attention to Miranda, now their mutual wife. His reaction to this new doctrine would have been anything but certain. However, he eventually responded with enthusiasm and took 2 plural wives of his own in 1843. End quote. Commodity. In Joe's church, the commodities started out as an economy of revelations, and then it became an economy of women. it makes me so uncomfortable, and I don't like it, and it's gross, and it's wrong, and it's rape, and I hate it, and it's gross, and I hate this. Okay, powering through. Let's get through this. Let's finish the episode. Deep breath. Take a deep breath with me, everybody. Joe was amazing at disguising his jealousy for other men's wives as piety and making them feel like they were the ones who were jealous and in eternal error for refusing his advances. Hearken, obey the counsel of my servant Joseph in all things. If you don't, then you are defying the words of God. This is one example of Joe's gaslighting masterclass. That's episode 134. Now, earlier in this episode, I described how Joe's revelations treated women like objects, and pretty much that it always put them in subjugation to men. Now, one of the apologist counter-arguments against this is, Joe created the Relief... Sorry, an apologist would never say Joe. Joseph Smith created the Relief Society in 1842, the longest-running American... female society, benevolent society. It's truly a remarkable thing. Well, Joe said some pretty empowering things to the Relief Society. For instance, according to the Book of the Law of the Lord, the Baal Law, on April 8th, 1842, Joe, quote, gave a lecture on the priesthood, shewing how the sisters would come in possession of the privileges and blessings and gifts of the priesthood, and that the signs should follow them, such as healing the sick and casting out devils, end quote. According to the Relief Society minutes, he created a female presidency to preside over the Relief Society, quote, just as the presidency preside over the church, end quote. He told the sisters that the society should move according to the ancient priesthood, and that he was going to make of this society a kingdom of priests, as in Enoch's day, as in Paul's day. He also said that the keys of the kingdom are about to be given to them, that they may be able to detect everything false as well as to the elders. That's episodes 101 and 102. You get the idea. Joe and early Mormons and early Mormon leaders, right, they can be quote mined all day to substantiate the claim that women were given the priesthood, or that it was a progressive church. But when you really dig into what Joe thought and what he was doing with the Relief Society, it doesn't look quite so egalitarian or feminist. Linda Newell and Val Avery write about the purposes of the Relief Society in Mormon Enigma, page 108, quote, Emma and Joseph together outlined the purposes of the society, which were to provoke the brethren to good works, to save the elder the trouble of rebuking, to look after the wants of the poor, to do good, to deal frankly with each other, and to correct the morals of the community, end quote. Now, all that is fine, but the part I'm interested in the part where it says, to save the elders the trouble of the rebuking. In other words, Joe is hoping that the women are going to police themselves so that he won't have to police them. So at least part of the purpose of this organization is to control the women. This, in my opinion, like all that points to the real reason for forming the Relief Society, to cut down on rumors of polygamy and to create a system of tests to filter through the women who'd be most likely to accept of the new and everlasting covenant, the law of celestial marriage. In many ways, the Relief Society was a testing ground for which women would be good Masons by not revealing the secrets about the men that were revealed to them. And in a lecture to the Relief Society called Try the Spirits, Joe criticized a woman named Joanna Southcott, who had started her own church just a few decades before he did. That's episode 108. Quote, Joanna Southcott professed to be a prophetess and wrote a book of prophecies in 1804. She became the founder and did so actually in the biblical style. Sounds a lot like Joe's revelations. It's not just a book of prophecies. It's like 60 books of prophecies. She was a lot more prolific than Joe was. Anyway, Joe continues. She became the founder of a people that are now extant. She was to bring forth in a place appointed a son that was to be the Messiah, which thing has failed. Independent of this, however, where do we read of a woman that was the founder of a church in the Word of God? Paul told the women in his day to keep silence in the church, and that if they wished to know anything, to ask their husbands at home. He would not suffer a woman to rule or to usurp authority in the church. But here we find a woman, the founder of a church, the revelator and guide, the Alpha and Omega, contrary to all acknowledged rule, principle, and order. End quote. Joe, using biblical teachings from the New Testament, told the Relief Society women to shut up, sit down, and submit to the men, because the divine order doesn't allow a woman to have any authority over the men in the church. He attacks Joanna Southcott, and in the same sermon, he goes on to attack a couple of other cults led by women, including the Catholic Apostolic Church, which was founded by Edward Irving in England. But what was wrong with Edward Irving's church in England? Joe explains for us. Quote, "First, the church was organized by women, and God placed in the church first apostles, secondarily prophets, and not first women. But Mr. Irving placed in his church first women, secondarily apostles, and the church was founded and organized by them. A woman has no right to found or organize a church. God never sent them to do it. Second, those women would speak in the midst of a meeting and rebuke Mr. Irving or any of the church." He's probably a snowflake cuck. Yeah, that's what's going on. Now, I say that because that's the common attack against men who are feminists. You're just disputing the women's rights stuff just so you can get laid. Or maybe Mr. Irving was just an early feminist, and you're just an idiot. Yeah, Joe, you're an idiot. That's what I'm saying here. Mr. Irving or any of the church. Now the scripture positively says, "Thou shalt not rebuke an elder, but entreat him as a father." You shall not rebuke an elder. You can't even speak against the men. You can't rebuke them, but entreat him as your father. Not only this, but they frequently accuse the brethren, thus placing themselves in the seat of Satan, who is emphatically called the accuser of the brethren. End quote. Joe gave this lecture to the Relief Society women just a week after it was founded. This was a huge power move. This was a priesthood flex to make sure that the women still knew who was actually in control of the situation. Any of those other churches, any of those other cults that put women in any sort of leadership position, they are all Satan. They are all evil. They are all wrong. Whether they're Mr. Irving, who creates a church that allows women in the leadership, or whether it's Joanna Southcott, who forms her own church. They're all wrong. Joe was super jealous of his manufactured power. So maybe he gave them some form of priesthood, but he just denied them the power thereof. He planned to, if he did give them, to what extent he gave them any form of leadership, it was strictly within the parameters that he defined. And after delivering this screed, Joe left the meeting, but then Emma took the pulpit and spoke of some scandalous rumors that were being circulated by a woman named Clarissa Marvel. Now, it seems as if Clarissa Marvel's rumors may have concerned the polygamous marriage between Joe and Agnes Coolbrith, who was his sister-in-law. Or maybe she herself had been propositioned, Clarissa herself. The historical record is just too ambiguous here. But here again is an excerpt from Mormon Enigma, page 108. Quote, Emma reported that a young woman, Clarissa Marvel, was accused of telling scandalous falsehoods on the character of President Joseph Smith without the least provocation, and asked that they would, in wisdom, adopt some plan to bring her to repentance. She continued, I presume that most of you know more about Clarissa Marvel than I. Agnes Coolbrith Smith, Don Carlos's widow, came to the accused girl's defense. Don Carlos is Joe's younger brother, who died in 1841. This is just like 5 months after Don Carlos had died, and like 3 months after Agnes and Joe had been sealed. Or sealing didn't actually exist at this time, but when they had relations of some sort. Now, anyway, continuing on. Agnes Coolbrith Smith, Don Carlo's widow, came to the accused girl's defense, apparently unaware that gossip linked her own name to Joseph's. Clarissa Marvel lived with me nearly a year and I saw nothing amiss of her, she reported. End quote. Now, Avery and Newell in Mormon Enigma here take some liberties drawing the connection of Agnes coming to Clarissa's defense, and that being because the rumors involved Agnes's and Joe's marriage. But that speculation could be completely accurate. It's speculative, though. Like I said, the record's ambiguous enough to read it in a few different ways. But this issue in the first two meetings of the Relief Society here was only just the beginning. It wouldn't be for another few weeks until it was wrapped up, during which it was made abundantly clear that the Relief Society isn't just a 2-hour gossip session every week, but had a much loftier goal, like silencing women who would spread such scandalous fake news about the one true prophet and his harem of concubines. At the Relief Society meeting in mid-April, Emma took the pulpit again and read another epistle from Joe, once again trying to stifle rumors. Quote, "We have been informed that some unprincipled men have been guilty of such crimes. We do not mention their names, not knowing but what there may be some among you who are not sufficiently skilled in masonry as to keep a secret. Let this epistle be had as a private matter in your society, and then we shall learn whether you are good masons." End quote. Joe modeled the Nauvoo Relief Society on Freemasonry. Simple. And you know what Joe once said about Freemasonry? The secret of Masonry is to keep a secret. So it really seems like he designed the Nauvoo Relief Society as a way of slowing down the rumor mill, or at least putting in systems of control within it and teaching the women how to keep secrets of polygamy, which also became one of the selling points when he or Bennett or any of the other guys will go proposition wives. It's not a sin if it's only held between the two of us. If nobody knows about it, then there's no sin in it. Said by a lot of guys that practice polygamy in Nauvoo. He created a stratified system of Relief Society leadership based on Masonry to ensure compliance and to keep a cap on the rumors. Episode 161. So the question is, was he really interested in giving women the priesthood? Or was he just interested in making women feel like they had been initiated into a secret order of priestesses and that they needed to keep its secrets? Most of which revolved around polygamy. Now, historians have read this passage from the Relief Society Minutes as a general rebuke of John C. Reckitt Bennett because he had apostatized from the church. He'd been excommunicated. He had resigned as mayor soon after the foundation of the Relief Society. But I called Joe and Bennett kindred scoundrels for a reason. The perceived crimes here are largely semantic, only being distinguished by who is or isn't approved by the prophet to practice polygamy. Episodes 107, 108, 110, 111, 115, and 161. So let's dig into one more interesting story about Joe's jealousy here with respect to polygamy. According to William Clayton, by May of 1843, Joe's first wife, Emma, was in an absolute fury over Joe's polygamy. She had learned a lot about it, and there was a lot of secrets, a lot of whispers, a lot of murmurs. She'd been cut out of a lot of her circles of friends. Well, she had tried to accommodate this, but she vacillated. And at this point in May of 1843, she lost her patience, but then she gained it again, but then she lost it again. It's a very confusing time here. So this is from Clayton's diary, and this is William Clayton, or Quilliam Claypen, as we call him. Quote, May 29th, 1843. This morning, President Joseph told me that he felt as though I was not treating him exactly right and asked if I had used any familiarity with Emma. Ooh, the prophet's talking to you. Hey, are you coming on to my wife? No, to be fair, aren't you coming on to everybody's wife? Like every dude's wife in town? Quilliam was he was one of Joe's dogs here, right? From continuing on, I told him by no means and explained to his satisfaction. Next entry, June 23rd, 1843. I would love to know what happens in between those, but, well, we can't find it. We don't have the journal. This morning, President Joseph took me and conversed considerable concerning some delicate matters. Said Emma wanted to lay a snare for me. Now that me there, historians dispute as to whether that snare was for Joseph or that snare was for William. He goes on to say, Joseph told me last night of this and said he had felt troubled. He said Emma had treated him coldly and badly since I came, and he knew she was disposed to be revenged on him for some things. She thought that if he would indulge himself, she would too. He cautioned me very kindly, for which I felt thankful. End quote. If only we had the entirety of Quilliam Claypen's Nauvoo journal released to the public, like the church promised 4 years ago, instead of it remaining suppressed in the church vaults. Maybe we'd be able to understand a bit more of the context of what actually happened here. Speculation it is then, because we have no other options. From the available text, it seems that Joe believed that Emma was looking to maybe take revenge on Joe by sleeping with William Clayton. Who knows? So maybe it wasn't just William Law who Emma thought was a sweet little man, but William Clayton, Quilliam Claypen as well. And those allegations are coming from a far more trustworthy source. Or maybe Joseph Jackson, who talked about Emma saying that William Law was a sweet little man, maybe Joseph Jackson just mixed up the two Williams. I'm not sure, right? We need William Clayton's journal. We just need it. It'd be really nice to have that. But of course, look, Joe can sleep with and frankly, and rape all the women that he wants, right? But if Emma wants to enjoy the blessings of an open relationship, no, we don't do that here. Multiple partners is the blessing of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not Sarah, Ruth, and Esther. This situation apparently escalated to the point where, according to William Law, quote, Joseph offered to furnish his wife Emma with a substitute for him by way of compensation for his neglect of her, on condition that she would forever stop her opposition to polygamy and permit him to enjoy his young wives in peace and keep some of them in his house and to be well treated, etc. End quote. So it seems that eventually Joe caved into Emma's wrath and agreed to allow Emma a mancubine. I mean, whatever the male equivalent of a mistress is, a mister, I guess. I don't know, but apparently it shows the failings in the inherent sexism in our language, doesn't it? I don't have a proper term for that. That maybe in my own failings more. Anyway, apparently Joe couldn't bring himself to actually go through with this little plan, this little deal that they worked out. They adjusted their marriage contract, and then Joe became uncomfortable by it and wanted to be able to do whatever he wanted while still being able to control his first wife. Of course, because that's how all men like this work, right? So Joe couldn't bring himself to go through with it because the following month, Joe, after this little deal was brokered, Joe received a Doctrine and Covenants section 132, the infamous, notoriously horrible revelation on plural marriage. Here's verse 51, quote, Verily I say unto you, a commandment I give unto mine handmaid Emma Smith, your wife, whom I have given unto you. This is a conversation between God and Joseph, right? There's Emma is not being spoken to here. This is a conversation that God is telling Joe how to deal with his wife, right? Emma Smith, your wife, whom I have given unto you, like she's a possession, that she stay herself and partake not of that which I commanded you to offer unto her. For I did it, saith the Lord, to prove you all, as I did Abraham, and that I might require an offering at your hand by covenant and sacrifice. End quote. Joe apparently had given in and allowed Emma to have a little relationship with another man. It is one step towards being slightly not so unfair when he's got 36 wives, right? It's one slight step towards more balance, more fairness in an open relationship. So he gave in and allowed Emma to have that, but then he called celestial takesies backsies with a thus saith the Lord in D&C 132, and commanded Emma to stay herself and partake not of that which I commanded you to offer unto her. According to, let's lay this out, brass tacks, according to the voice in Joe's head, whether he made it say what he wanted it to say, or it just so happened to coincidentally say whatever he was thinking, right? Kind of a hard distinction to make. According to the voice in the prophet God's head, the whole thing had been an Abrahamic test. Remember that story in the Bible where God commands Abraham to sacrifice, to kill his son Isaac? And then just as old Abe was about to plunge the knife into Isaac's chest, and a child fearing for their life, and he just says, oh, just kidding, it's a test, to sacrifice this ram that I provided you instead. Apparently, letting Emma sleep with other men was Joe's test. Had nothing to do with her. It was a test for Joe. But conveniently, God declared at the last second that the whole thing was just a big joke. Ha! Oh, I'm sorry, Joseph. I would never actually make you jealous like that. You're my prophet. I love you too much to make you feel slight sense of jealousy in exchange for being able to rape a bunch of teenagers. I'm sorry that I made you uncomfortable, prophet. I'll try and treat my servants better with the commodities of women that I give him. It is amazing to me, and it probably shouldn't be amazing, but it is. It is amazing to me how Joe was able to use the Bible to come to whatever conclusion was most convenient and beneficial to him alone. And when the Bible didn't suffice, he could just come up with new scripture, new Bible stuffs to get his way. He, of course, just a few verses later in Doctrine and Covenants 132 said that any woman who refuses to allow her husband to have another wife is herself damned. The Law of Sarah. Such a wonderful bit of the polygamy revelation, isn't it? Real great stuff in that horrible little book. Episodes 148 and 149. Now, okay, so zooming out. Deep breath. No matter what it was, women, businesses, property, money, social status, follows and retweets, newspaper headlines, any quantifiable commodity. Joe couldn't stand being deprived of it. His avaricious nature with respect to all aspects of worldly wealth, tangible or intangible, could never be satisfied. It was all short-sighted gratification. And as soon as he partook of whatever it was that he was pursuing at any given moment, he always wanted more. This drive, this animalistic and ravenous greed for more, it didn't come from nothing. It was the result of a pattern of deprivation, owing to the destitution and desiring what others have that he didn't have. Growing up, Joe saw people with more than he had, and he couldn't stand it. So he developed a set of tools to selfishly get what they had. Most of the time, that tool was, I prophesy in the name of the Lord that if you don't give me that thing or do a thing for me, then you'll suffer the wrath of the Almighty God for depriving his servant of that which he wants to have sex with most to build the kingdom of God, right? Joe's mind was ruled by a viciously competitive scarcity. If he was to have a piece of the pie, he needed to take somebody else's pie instead of making his own damn pie. Now look, there are traits people generally agree are laudable, right? Like people tend to gravitate towards individuals who exhibit honorable traits. Altruism, ambition, charisma, respectability, industriousness, compassion, and that list can extend for pages, right? On the flip side of that coin, there are plenty of human traits which tend to make us averse towards somebody or not like them much. Selfishness, narcissism, charisma, ambitiousness, industriousness, they fall into that negative category now that I think about it, right? But you know what I'm saying, right? Certain people we generally respect for certain reasons. Others don't deserve our respect for what comprises their character. When a person exhibits certain character traits, it makes us feel certain ways. And they can instill a sense of trust or distrust, honor or dishonor, love or hate. Those emotions that we feel in response to the stimuli that the person gives us existed long before we had the vocabulary to describe them. And that's because those emotions instill some evolutionary advantage. Those emotions teach us about ourselves. They teach us about society, and they reciprocate and in turn form the unspoken social contracts that construct our society. They teach us about the situation around us. They teach us about the people with whom we associate. The thing is, I spend a lot of time studying early Mormon history and the life of its founding prophet, and I can't help but feel disgusted and repulsed and just generally reviled by what I see. That's hard to deal with because it reveals to me the fact that two people can look at the same person or character trait and see it completely differently. Right? A believer and a non-believer can come away with completely opposite value judgments of Joseph Smith's character. Longtime listeners of this show will remember how much I've talked in the backlog about the cardboard cutout prophet that I was taught to worship as a kid. You know that Joseph Smith, right? Handsome, muscular, blue eyes, blonde hair, reading from the gold plates on a table with Oliver Cowdery, studiously scratched every word the prophet spoke as it came to him by the gift and power of God. The man who was a theologian, who always had a clever quip to any naysayer or skeptic. The man who never hurt a fly. And the only people who didn't like him were led astray by the adversary. It was religious persecution. I was indoctrinated into that belief. I was indoctrinated into the belief that a portrait of an incredibly complex figure was worthy of respect. I sang praise to him because he communed with Jehovah, and that was my favorite hymn. That cardboard cutout, that portrait of a man larger than life that's hanging in every Mormon chapel, is a lie. It's all tainted history, correlated and crafted over nearly 2 centuries to sell a religion. Something that is predicated on untestable claims. If Mormons want to be more transparent about their history, don't hang a portrait of a dark-skinned Jesus or a Joseph Smith with like his head stuffed in a hat, as in a misplaced drive towards transparency. Hang the real portrait of the real Joseph Smith. Listeners, you know what portrait I'm talking about. We talked about this back on episode 206. This portrait's titled The Last Public Address of Lieutenant General Joseph Smith. In case you haven't seen this portrait of the prophet, I'm going to do my best to paint the picture in your mind. In the far background of this painting, you can see the Nauvoo Temple near completion on the hill, overlooking the flats of Nauvoo below an overcast sky. In the midground of this painting are some wooden shacks, possibly Widow's Row, and a large white 2-story building. Now, the mid-foreground features hundreds of people. Every square inch of dead space of this painting is somebody's face. Not full bodies, just their faces. Rows and rows and rows of Nauvoo legionnaires run the entire length of the painting, and people are flooding out of the 2-story building, and they're crowding around the centerpiece in the foreground of the painting, which is a makeshift wooden platform with 3 men standing and 1 man sitting on it. A redcoat man stands behind and to the side of 2 men in blue shirts, while the sitting man is wearing a black shirt and holding his top hat in his hands. There, at the front of the stage, with thousands of people staring in awe and wonder, at the center of this picture is a rotund Lieutenant General Joseph Smith, dressed in white pants, long black boots, a blue military uniform, and gold fringe shoulder caps with a receding hairline. His sword is unsheathed and pointed to the sky. The American flag with a golden eagle cap stands behind him, almost in like his shadow, as if it's an afterthought, or maybe it's deliberate placement by the artist. In the crowd of Nauvoo citizens surrounding the rows and rows and rows of Nauvoo legionnaires with their rifles in hand is comprised of people wearing black. Many of them are shady looking in their pale-faced figures. One of them is a baby holding a trumpet. Among the onlookers are 3 men dressed in black military uniforms on horses, clearly disrupting the citizens who are listening to the last public address of their supreme leader. This painting is fascinating, but far more fascinating is the historical context it depicts. And I encourage listeners to check it out, the last public address of Lieutenant General Joseph Smith. The Nauvoo Legion is there because Nauvoo Legion was under a declaration of martial law that Joe had declared to keep himself safe from the state militia sent there by the governor of Illinois, Thomas Ford. The 3 men dressed in black military uniforms are there to arrest Joseph Smith for inciting riot, manufacturing counterfeit money, and committing treason by declaring martial law. Joe had spent the previous 4 years fueling tensions with the non-Mormon settlements surrounding Nauvoo, as any good criminal kingpin does, and the whole region was on the precipice of civil war, to the point that the governor of Illinois had traveled over 120 miles on horseback to handle matters personally to keep his state from spiraling out of control into civil war, like had happened with Governor Lilburn Boggs in Missouri during the Mormon War of 1838, just 6 years earlier. And Joseph Smith's personal military at this time numbered over 3,300 men, and over 1,300 state militiamen surrounded the Nauvoo Mormon settlement, awaiting thousands of reinforcements from Missouri and the governor's order to lay siege on the city. Sadly, though, that portrait will never usurp the fictional portraits of the prophet studying his gold plates as he and Oliver Cowdery translate the Book of Mormon. That's because the church isn't just hiding its history, it's hiding from its history, which is far more insidious. The propagandized prophet started with the man himself, and his legions of sycophants have been generationally pushing his lies ever since. People talk about problems in Mormon history, like the historicity of the Book of Abraham or the Book of Mormon, or, polygamy, plagiarism from Adam Clark's biblical commentary, the Kinderhook plates, as if like those are indictments of Joe's claims to divinity. To contend, and this is my personal view, to contend over these issues is fighting on the battlefield laid out by the correlated narrative of lies and half-truths. It's a battlefield laid out by the apologists. And I don't know about you, but I'm not interested in fighting on a battlefield with tactical disadvantage, where the bodies of skeptics lie slain by grand battles since the inception of the religion. I will fight there, but I'm far more interested in a battlefield where I can sit at a tactical advantage. And luckily for us, the soft social science of history lays out that strategically advantageous battlefield for us. All we have to do is recognize that it exists and drag our opponent kicking and screaming away from their home field advantage. How do we fight on a level playing field? One simple question. What is one quality of Joseph Smith that makes him a good person? The apologist doesn't even have to prove that Joe had visitations with angels, literally translated a historical record of literal gold plates written in Reformed Egyptian by ancient Native American Jews that sailed over on submarines in 2600 BC. Just give me one quality of Joe's character that's worthy of calling him a good person. Not a prophet of God, just a good person. At this stage of the battle, the apologist doesn't even have to prove the existence of God, that God communicates with humans, that those humans are prophets, that Joseph Smith was a prophet, and that, Joe didn't stray from, or become a fallen prophet at any point in his life, right? Those are conversations that can happen once the first salvo is fired, and that first salvo is proving a single act in Joe's life that was done out of pure altruism. Now, they may say that he did the most important thing in American history. He restored the one true gospel. That's the most moral thing a person could do. But that's an unacceptable answer when we view the man through a naturalistic lens. And why? Because starting a religion in nearly every case of human history has led to more suffering than welfare of humans. Religions are started for the sole benefit of the guy who says, I speak for God, and anybody who doesn't believe me is a heretic, an infidel, less than human, and we can therefore justify torturing, enslaving, and killing them. Therefore, starting a religion is one of the most immoral and malevolent things that a person can do. An apologist who makes this argument is already starting the battle by firing the first volley at themselves. Without getting lost in the argument of whether or not there's such a thing as like pure selflessness, there's absolutely nothing in Joe's life that exhibits altruism, compassion, kindness, genuine love, charity, or any other trait worthy of respect that would stimulate that feeling inside of our mind that causes us to respect him. His life was marked by one selfish act to the next, with no regard for the cost or damage caused by his relentless pursuit of wealth, power, and control, and his insatiable envy for what lay beyond his reach. I've often wondered why it is that historians spend so much time on Joe's life pre-Book of Mormon, pre-religion, pre-public persona of prophetseer and revelator. That drive lies in establishing patterns of deception, fraud, and pathological lying for short-term self-aggrandizement that carried him into his public ministry. If we can prove that Joe lied before 1830, then what reason do we have to believe that he wasn't lying after 1830 when he was a prophet of God? That's a reasonable justification for studying so thoroughly his early life. But at the end of the day, if it's done with the agenda to prove that he didn't actually talk to God, or like that he just fabricated when he said, "Thus saith the Lord," like that's completely unnecessary. That's because we can look at his life after he published the Book of Mormon and founded the church, which reveals those same patterns of deception, fraud, and pathological lying for short-term self-aggrandizement, only at a much larger scale. No matter how many times we shatter every mirror of this propagandized version of the prophet, he reappears with a crooked smile and weathered face to steal away the livelihood, the passions, and the very lives of ourselves and our loved ones, who return to church every week and continue to sing praise to the man who lied about everything. Once Mormons have given everything to the church and the legacy of this one dude, they devolve into a childlike status of dependence on the parasite that extracted their autonomy from them to begin with. So to capture today's episode, let's close with a quote from William Law, second counselor in the first presidency, who left the church and started his own church in 1844 after he learned all about polygamy and published the Nauvoo Expositor. Quote, "One trait was Joseph's jealousy of his friends, lest any of them should be deemed before him in the eyes of the church or of the public. He would destroy his best friend for the sake of a few $100s. It was his policy to get away with a man's money, first because he wanted it, and second because he believed that in getting a man's money, he deprived him of power and position and left him in a measure helpless and dependent. He was a tyrant. Self-exaltation and gratification of his grosser passions with an entire disregard of others' rights. And of all morality led to his destruction at last." End quote. There are so many more stories in early Mormonism that I want to share with you. But there are also thousands of podcasts out there that are better than this one, so I'm going to release you until next week while I go and try to figure out exactly how they do it. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.bandcamp.com and used with permission. Legal counsel is provided by Andrew Torres of the Law Offices of P. Andrew Torres and the Opening Arguments podcast. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC. Copyright 2020. All rights reserved.